On December 20th, 2019, then President Donald Trump signed a defense spending act that included within it a provision to create the country's sixth military branch, the U.S. Space Force. Despite some late-night ribbing about the name of the force,
Space Force,
its logo and its uniforms, the force's mission is actually very simple and deadly serious: to protect the United States and allied interests in space. That becomes increasingly important as major tensions dominate U.S. relations with both Russia and China, nations with ever more powerful space programs. I want to welcome the head of the Space Force, General John Raymond, to GPS for an exclusive interview. General, thanks for coming on.
Freed, sir, thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So we know about the tensions on Earth. We know about the tensions between, with Russia, with China. If we were to look up in space, what would we see? Would we see some kind of a mirror image of those tensions that we have on Earth?
Well, let me just start by saying that, the U.S. has been a spacefaring nation since the 1950s. And that status of being a spacefaring nation gives us great advantage. Space underpins all of our instruments of national power, whether it's diplomatic, information, military, or economic. And it is a domain of competition, just like all other domains, air, land, and sea. And so as you were to look up in space, you'd see a domain that's changed pretty significantly over the last couple decades, a domain that's become much more congested with the numbers of objects that we're tracking close to 50,000. Which just a few years ago, I would have told you it was only about 22,000. The numbers of satellites that are up in space have gone from about 1,500 a couple of years ago to almost 5,000 today. We see increased competition. We see an increased contested nature of the domain.
So every now and then you hear about the Russians or the Chinese blowing up a satellite, which I've always assumed was a kind of, warning or, showing off the capacity to take down satellites. The U.S. obviously has the most in the world and the most critical ones. How do you read those explosions?
First of all, I read them as being very reckless and irresponsible behavior. The space domain is a domain for global use, and it provides great opportunity for the nations of the world. And what we have seen is a spectrum of threats that have materialized over the last decade or so. Everything from reversible jamming of communication satellites and GPS satellites to directed energy threats, think lasers that can blind or dazzle satellites, to missiles that can launch from the ground and destroy satellites, which is what you just mentioned. And Russia did that back in this past November, where they launched a missile and blew up a satellite in low Earth orbit into a little over 1,500 pieces of debris. We're still tracking that debris. We're still warning folks across the globe we act as a space traffic control for the world, if you will, to make sure that people don't hit that pieces of debris. We protect the International Space Station along with our partners at NASA. And we found that behavior very reckless and very irresponsible.
The big new entrant here is, of course, China, which is completing a big space station, Tiangong. Tell us about that, and how would you rate China's space capabilities?
They've come a long way in a very short period of time. I would say China is going 0 to 60 very, very fast. It wasn't too long ago that they didn't have significant space capabilities, and today they do. And so God forbid if deterrence were to fail and we were to get into a conflict, and again, our desire is not to. Our desire is to deter that conflict from happening. But if we did, we would be up against an adversary that has the same space capabilities and the same advantages that we currently enjoy. They use those capabilities to track our ground forces, our maritime forces, our air forces, and it's a threat to those forces.
General, let me ask you finally what people, I'm sure must ask you all the time. So when you're tracking all this stuff out there, are you also tracking for whether or not there's any kind of life out there, aliens, weird objects?
We do not track that specifically. We're much closer, focused much closer to home. And that's not part of our mission set. We're really focused on making sure that every American and our allies and partners and our joint and coalition forces have the space capabilities they need to both fuel our American way of life and to fuel our American way of war.
Good enough. Thank you, sir. Real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Said that Israel had not really condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I misspoke. Israel has voted to condemn it at the United Nations. Thanks to all of you for being part of my program this week. I will see you next week.